I would tonight, after Dr. Hill and Dr. Kushlis complete their remarks or their dialogue, we'll go to a Q&A session. And if you have a question you would like to pose, please use the chat feature of Zoom. In the center of your screen at the bottom, there's a button that's called chat. If you click it, it will give you the opportunity to add to pose your questions. And let me also say we have upcoming programs that you may be interested in participating in. On Tuesday, March the 8th, we'll have Brigadier General Stephen Cheney from the American Security Project talking about climate and global security. On Tuesday, April the 5th, we'll have Rachel Rizzo from the Atlantic Council talking to us about Germany's new leadership. On Thursday, April the 7th, we'll have Behnam Talabu from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He'll be talking to us about Iran and the nuclear deal. And then on Thursday, May 19th, we'll have Ambassador Fred Hoff talking to us about Syria. Tonight, we are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Fiona Hill speaking to us. Dr. Hill is currently with the Brookings Institute. Previously, she was at the National Security Council at the White House. I think everybody knows that. And having a conversation with her will be our own Dr. Patricia Kushlis. Pat lives in Santa Fe, is president of the Santa Fe World Affairs Council, is a retired Foreign Service officer who has served both in Russia and Finland and numerous other postings around the world. They are both extremely qualified to talk to us about our subject tonight. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to them and I will go away.
Okay, Bob, thank you very much. I guess I'll start with this. It seems like an eternity since the Russian military invaded Ukraine, but it was really just a week ago. And you spent your career as a Russian expert, and I wonder how you see this seemingly single-minded intent or drive on the part of President Vladimir Putin to dominate Ukraine politically, economically, militarily, and geographically. What I don't understand is why Ukraine is important enough to Putin to launch a full-scale invasion. This is a country that's not threatened Russia, and whose population the Russians claim are their Slavic brothers.
Well, Pat, thank you so much, and also to Bob and everybody for having me here tonight. I'm really delighted to join you. Wish I was actually in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and generally rather than in DC. It's looking, as I can see through Pat's window, and I could see through Bob's earlier, it looks much nicer than how it looks out of mine right now. But, you know, as you've pointed out, Pat, and obviously, you know, you're pretty familiar with this yourself, having served in Russia and also in Finland, which has some relevance to where we are today. Putin has proven to be pretty obsessed with Ukraine. And it's not so much that Ukraine has threatened Russia, which Finland didn't in its time either, but it's that Ukraine, like Finland and many other countries, were once part of the Russian Empire. And a lot of people have talked about, is Putin trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union? You know, is this just to try to stop Ukraine from joining NATO? Is this because it's a proxy war between Russia and the United States? I mean, that's been part of the Russian propaganda, frankly. There's all kinds of things that are floating around out there. But I think we've seen very clearly and very unfortunately from some of the recent statements that Vladimir Putin has made, is that he has delved right back into history as part of his justification for this action against Ukraine. In fact, to the point when both Finland and most of the lands of Ukraine were part of the Russian Empire, not even the Soviet Union, because of course Finland got its independence after the collapse of the Russian Empire during World War I. In 1940, the Soviet Union actually tried to retake Finland, didn't manage to, but this the so-called Winter War, because the Finns fought them back again. And Finland managed to sort of escape, as it were, with its independence, but being shorn of a huge swathe of territory in the region of Karelia, in and around what's modern day St. Petersburg of Russia. So a huge swathe of Russian territory in the northwest of Russia, bordering onto Finland, is in fact former Finnish territory. And in some respects, people have thought, well, maybe this is what Putin's trying to do again with Ukraine. He said, repeatedly that Ukraine isn't a country, that isn't a real country. Part of it was in Eastern Europe, and part of it was given to Russia. And, initially when this all started off, because as you said, it seems like an eternity, because we've been dealing one way or another with a conflict in Ukraine now for best part of the last 8 years, since the annexation of Crimea. There's kind of a feeling that Ukraine was sort of moving away from Russia, but also like Finland being shorn of territory. Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea, the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But now we see that Russia is focused on a full invasion. And Putin has also made it quite clear why that is. He's made it clear that he doesn't want Ukraine to have any independent, autonomous existence without being under the thumb of Russia. He said today to President Macron of France that he's not finished. He's called this, basically a liberation of Ukraine, liberating it from this bizarrely titled drug-addled neo-fascist Nazi leadership. But he's talked also about the West pulling Ukraine away from Russia. It's not just about NATO, from basically separating two peoples who are so kindred that, they may as well be one and the same, Ukrainians and Russians, which is, actually really a kind of concoction derived from his own historical narratives. And now we see very, very clearly that Putin's intent, if it's not Russia's intent, because there's one man who has made this decision, is not to stop until he's fully subjugated Ukraine. He wants it to be even perhaps carved up, part of it even more annexed into Russia, but the rest of it having no prospect for any viable independence. So there's a lot going on there. And unfortunately, it has roots in the past, the distant past in many respects, the more recent past, the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But an awful lot of it has to do with Vladimir Putin making what was in many respects a fateful, if not fatal, choice.
Okay, let me turn to the whether or not you think the Russian government has misread, or Putin has misread, Ukrainian nationalism and the strength of its government and people to resist. When I was working in Helsinki, as you rightly mentioned, I was there at the end of the Cold War, and it was clear that the Soviet government at that time failed to understand the minority republics, and this included the Ukrainians. But it was certainly the Balts, the Moldovans, and the Georgians. And as a result, they made mistake after mistake. But they frankly didn't understand the Finns either. Maybe it's because I didn't understand Finnish. I don't know. That's another story. But Ukrainian, the language is much closer to Russia, and history is much. They come from way back. They come from the same, the same territory and so forth, and the same, and Slavs. But I'm just wondering if at least in the first go around, did Putin also suffer from some of these same blinders? Why are they so determined to go after it, to suppress it? This is not Chechnya. This is not Georgia, which are comparatively pretty easy.
I think these are really great questions, Pat, and you've already, in a way, started to answer them as well by, laying this out. When you talked about Georgia and Chechnya at the end, Chechnya, of course, being part of the Russian Federation, but there was also, after an uprising there and an attempt by the Chechens to secede, the Russians government at the time under Boris Yeltsin thought that they could actually pull them back extraordinarily quickly. the Russian leader at that, military leader at that point, General Pavel Grachev, reportedly told Yeltsin, I'll be in and out and you'll never even know I was there in Chechnya. And this then dragged on for best part of a decade as well, of a really brutal conflict. And, kind of the implications and ramifications from that have been quite profound for Russia itself. I mean, Chechnya today is run by a thug strongman, self-styled Islamist who is only really likely constrained and controlled by Putin himself, Ramzan Kadyrov, and Russia's using Chechen forces loyal to Kadyrov to now fight in Ukraine. And as you said, with Georgia invading in 2008, and that was a 10-day war. We're not to 10 days yet in this one, but there was a pretty quick defeat of Georgian forces. Russians didn't go as far as Tbilisi. And, obviously things have worked out quite to Putin's satisfaction there, where Georgia's been pretty marginalized and sort of a grey zone, to many respects now. So clearly they underestimated what was going to happen in Ukraine, perhaps on the basis of this, perhaps also on the basis of a total misreading of the very issues that you laid out there. Contrary to this being Finns, who fought back pretty bravely and determinately in 1940, and having a completely different, unrelated language, they have obviously thought that Ukraine, where a very large swathe of the population speaks Russian itself, where other, Ukrainians, there is, kind of a sort of small group of nationalists, but where, Ukrainians themselves have, in opinion polls, shown, not much hostility towards Russia until the annexation of Crimea. They sort of assumed that there would be not just the capitulation of the under strength in comparison to Russia, that is, Ukrainian military, and they outmanned, weaponed Ukrainian military, but that the Ukrainian people themselves would not have the stomach for a fight because, of course, this is kindred peoples. Yeah. And I think that they've had too much of thinking that identity is born on the basis of language. I mean, I come from, originally the United Kingdom, where, it's obviously English is one thing, but there's Welsh, Scots and Irish Gaelic. And I always remember, from growing up, that the Welsh didn't feel Scottish and the Scottish didn't feel Irish and the Irish didn't feel Welsh. And although their languages were interrelated, in actual fact, they weren't all so closely comprehensible. And although Ukrainian and Russian may be even closer than Welsh and Scots and Irish to each other, people tend to have a very strong sense of identity based on place, based on sort of shared history, and a whole host of other issues. And over the last 7 or 8 years, Ukraine and Russia have really pulled apart since Russia annexed Crimea. And it seems to me that Putin and the people around him didn't do their homework. They assumed that because they said it was the case, and Putin said it was the case, that Ukrainians and Russians felt like they were one and the same, that this would be literally a very easy intervention. Now, I think they also initially tried to minimize casualties because, again, if you're buying into this whole idea that their beef and their fight is with either the United States or NATO, or it's the Ukrainian government with this bizarre definition that they have of being a sort of a Nazi fascist government, despite the fact they're led by a Russian-speaking Ukrainian Jew, which sort of belies all of those kind of labeling. But nonetheless, you then think that the mass slaughter of Ukrainians and the creation of a massive refugee exodus would not be on the top of the list if you're trying to persuade everybody that you're here to liberate them. But anyway, here we are. And so I think that this is going to have one of these escalating, cascading effects. It's not just how Europe is reacting, but how you're really creating now a sense of enmity among people living in Ukraine, many of whom are ethnic Russians, many of whom are Russian speakers, but now are going to feel themselves very much forged with a Ukrainian identity, and will not, I think, go quietly into the night as the Russians hope. And even if Russia does take control of a number of cities, even if it flattens a whole host of cities, as it did in the case of Chechnya, the Ukrainians are going to fight back.
Yeah. No, I mean, I saw something very similar in the Baltics in the lead up to the end of the Cold War. And I also saw the same thing going to St. Petersburg or Leningrad at the time, talking with Russians and saying, oh, there are brothers. I don't think so. They don't see it that way.
You know, there's an interesting point Pat, I was just thinking of as you were mentioning again about the Cold War, that Putin himself in interviews in late 1999, as he was just preparing to take over the presidency when he'd already been appointed by Yeltsin, in an interview, he commented on Soviet interventions during the Cold War. He was asked if he thought that the interventions by the Soviet Union in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 were mistakes, and he said, yes, they were. And he also pointed to Germany in 1953. And he said, the Russophobia that we see now in Eastern Europe is the result of those interventions. And so he seems to have forgotten his own point and his own memory that the interventions, the heavy-handed interventions and the carnage that resulted from them, you know, you could also talk about Poland later on, although, you know, obviously that came under different circumstances, but think of Solidarność and the whole Polish resistance to, you know, the intervention in Poland then under when General Jaruzelski was the head. I mean, all of these should have shown to Putin, if he's remembered his own comments, that there was a great deal of risk in intervening in this fashion.
Let me turn to the book you wrote, Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, and you begin your analysis there of his character. And it's kind of in the middle of that, as a matter of fact, but it's fascinating. And one of the elements that you point out is that Putin's single-minded determination to fight to the bitter end, but then also to respect his opponent and to be adaptive in response to changing directions and the environment. And then another point you mentioned is to get to his desire to get out and talk to the Russian people. And I know this was earlier on, but since the pandemic, he's been really holed up in the Kremlin. And I'm just wondering how you think the latter is affecting his current behavior and his decision-making abilities.
Yeah, and I wonder also myself if that latter point that you're raising there might make him less adaptable and, you know, less likely to learn from mistakes, because how is information coming back from the battlefield to Putin? You know, I really wonder about that as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and you know, for somebody who's been in power for 22 years, increasingly isolated because of COVID, as we all have been. I mean, here we all sitting in our little Zoom boxes.
Right.
And we have access to an awful lot of information that I imagine that Putin actually discounts, because, you know, he's not out there watching TikTok videos or, you know, on Twitter. And, you know, we don't think that he has a, you know, an internet account. So he's relying on, you know, dispatches from the front coming to him. And, you know, what kind of information is he really getting? Does he really know the casualty levels? You know, it's very likely that this was plotted by Putin in secret with a bunch of generals, because it seems a lot of the troops who have gone into Ukraine didn't know either what they were doing. And certainly it looked like from this staged session with his National Security Council that Putin hadn't really taken, you know, even into consideration perhaps some of the reactions and responses and analysis of even some of the intelligence people, because it does look like they were taken a bit by surprise that this was going to happen. So that gets to your kind of point about, you know, what kind of information is he getting? He's not getting out there. In fact, he's made it extraordinarily difficult for people to get in and get access to him. You know, we saw the ridiculous lengths that he went to with Macron at the
that table.
In fact, I've got a picture here. I'm going to try to show it to everybody. I've got a picture of me at that same table. So there's Macron's table, but you can see there's a whole host of us at that. And it looks to me like with Putin and Macron sitting on it, he's even put extra leaves in because it's even longer. And that, you know, the same room with the parquet floor and everything. So it's kind of absurd, you know, kind of see him sitting here in this, you know, discussion and everything. And we see not only him sitting distance from Macron, who he clearly didn't want to catch COVID from, so he said, but also sitting extraordinarily far at either that table or other tables from some of his military advisors. So it just gives you a sort of a symbolic picture here, but one that is also borne out in reality, because I've talked to an awful lot of people who've said that, television crews, all kinds of people trying to get access on a normal basis have to quarantine for 2 weeks before they can get to see him in person. And then you can imagine how a telephone call's being screened, what kind of information is getting there, what's he thinking, what's he reading about. And I really worry, as I'm sure everybody else does, about a man that is kind of cut off from the actual reality. I mean, all of us have a really hard time basically managing all the information that we have, but Putin has been given it through layers of vetting. And so does he even really know what's happening on the ground? Because none of us can know, right? We only have a snapshot. So I think that gets really, to the point of there that he's kind of lost touch. He's lost touch with Russian people as well. I mean, it's clear that they're very nervous in Moscow right now about how the Russian people are going to react, because they're trying to keep the information. You're not allowed to call it a war. It's this kind of military technical operation. They've been obviously downplaying the losses. I mean, I exchanged emails with someone today on the ground in Ukraine. And they're reporting now, again, you have to take this with a pinch of salt because there's a lot of propaganda on the Ukrainian side as well, of, maybe up to 10,000 troops killed on the Russian side. Because, I mean, the Ukrainians are taking heavy casualties as well. But there are apparently, the bodies of young Russian soldiers strewn everywhere because the Russian military isn't taking them away with them. And, so they probably don't even know the full extent of the losses there. So, I mean, this is a really dreadful situation. And you may have somebody who is not at all in touch with the actual developments on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. And another thing that you mentioned, I think it was in another interview, and that was related to the puffy appearance of his face. And I just have to also, you talked about having sat next to him at a dinner a number of years ago, and he hardly spoke to you, that he was very nearsighted, worse than I am, I guess, and that he refused to eat or drink anything. I mean, that was a while ago. So it seems just to have gotten worse.
Yeah, I mean, that picture that I showed you there, I mean, you can't really sort of see it the size of the picture that I have here. That was 2018, so 3 or 4 years ago, and he's markedly different from that period and how he looked. I mean, the other was even longer ago, but he's not looking great. I mean, I guess all of us, don't feel so great at the moment either at the end of this rather, trying time. But here is someone who, he's getting older as everybody else is. He's going to be 70 in October. I mean, that's not that old, but, for a Russian man, although he does take care of himself, but, there's a lot of rumors about his health. I think we can be fairly sure that he just have some back issues. And, as I've sort of said in one of these interviews, I mean, people who have something like a herniated disc or sciatica, often taking steroids. And, it may be that. And of course, those can be mood enhancers as well. In different ways, that kind of marring judgment depends on, what you're taking, what kind of medications and things. But even putting that aside, what we've talked about just now, about someone who, lives in the bubble of the Kremlin or, the bubble of these various palaces and things that he has all over the place. This is not someone who's getting the ordinary give and take, and he's not somebody anyway who would confide in any one person. Because in the nature of the position that he's in, he's always having to play people off against each other. He might confide something in one person, something in another. And it's not that people are kind of approaching him with fresh information. I mean, I have seen in this kind of crowd on this, particular, set of people that were with him on this particular picture that I just showed you, that there's a kind of camaraderie with some of the people who were there. But those are his inner circle. Mm-hmm. And they're a very small number of people. He's not getting an awful lot of inputs here. So I think that all of this adds up, given the history, the concerns about NATO, his paranoia, and the way that he's depicted this whole conflict and the way that he's justified the invasion, and the fact that he said he's going to take it to the end, and that's his end game, is not getting out of there, but it's the end of Ukraine as we know it, as an independent sovereign country, then we're in for a really tough period ahead.
I guess, just a couple of, I just have to keep wondering why he ever let those photos be released to the media. Or does he even know it?
Which photographs?
Well, the photos of him at these, at these very long tables.
Oh, yes. No, I see what you mean. Yes. I don't know. I mean, I thought about that as well, because it shows weakness, right? It doesn't appear to show strength and command. No, you're right, because I think that this is actually a very interesting thing that you've touched on, Pat, here, because, obviously some things look differently inside for one audience inside Russia and very differently from the outside.
Exactly.
On the outside, we think it looks ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, we see weakness and somebody who is obviously ill at ease. Is he may be scared of, COVID, or he may be even scared of the other people that he's meeting with, that somebody might do something to him, right?
And yeah, I thought about that too.
It more looks like he's the man in charge, that he's sort of projecting command, and the other people are sitting away because they can't approach the person of the Tsar. Well, maybe that's what he thinks that this looks like. But I'm sure that other people are wondering, why on earth is he at the one end of the table and people are at the other? So you're absolutely right. I mean, he obviously did not think that they would be analysed and thought of in the way that we're discussing them.
You've talked a little bit about Russian society, and that he's totally out of touch with them. And I'm just wondering what you're seeing, what you're observing today.
Well, I think
the Russians know what's happening.
Yeah, I'm not so sure, how many Russians really know what's happening, and this is where it gets, kind of ambiguous and confusing, kind of in the Russian setting, because official polling is showing, basically support for this war, which, might seem surprising. But official polling is also showing, another polling, that the United States is blamed, the Ukrainians are blamed, NATO is blamed for this, Russia is not blamed. And there's a rallying around Putin, because he's he's the symbol of the state, and the state seems now to be under siege. Now, a lot of that is a result of the propaganda inside of Russia. And this gets to your other point about, do people really know what's happening? Because the Russian media has been telling them for years now that Ukraine is a hostile state, that NATO is encircling Russia, that the United States is out to get Russia, that everything that Russia suffers from is the result of Western saboteurs and people who are trying to encircle them and push them down onto their knees. You see this over and over again in the speeches again that Putin makes. And it's apparent from, I can just say it anecdotally, friends of mine who have called friends in Moscow, friends in Ukraine, and said, look, hey, this is what's happening, and their friends don't believe them. Or relatives. Okay. Some people do, because they're looking outside on the internet. But, if you're somebody like Putin, you would believe that everything that you see, we have plenty of people here in our own country who think that everything you see on television is propaganda, and sometimes it is, depending on what you're watching. But for Putin, he discounts anything that he sees in the Western media, because the Russian media environment is so distorted and deliberately manipulated. And he's just closed down, a couple of the independent outlets, TV Rain, Dost, and then Echo Moskvy, the Echo of Moscow, the independent radio and other broadcasting system. And so they're cutting people off from information, because they need to control that environment. And you also see what they're doing is they're clamping down on protests, because what Putin is paranoid about and very fearful of is mass protests that might, unseat him in some way, or, create a lot more instability. And he doesn't want people to find out exactly what's happening. So you're going to be now going into a period of really brutal repression, extreme censorship, and also the suppression of information inside of Russia.
Too much of the past.
That's right.
In reality. Okay. If Putin succeeds in conquering Ukraine, then what? What are his, you've talked a little bit about what his goals are. Are they, as you said, that he's now saying that he wants to conquer all of Ukraine. But then I think people are also concerned, is this just one step towards the implementation or the attempt to restore the Russian Empire at its greatest? And
I think he definitely wants to basically intimidate, coerce, and influence a much broader swathe of territory, you know, including scaring the heck out of Finland and Poland and the Baltic states and others as well, so that they're intimidated and, you know, pay close attention to Moscow. So he's made that very clear. There's already been efforts to pull back in, as it were, into Russia's orbit, Moscow's orbit, although, you know, not completely, obviously, into, you know, the Russian Federation itself. The other former Soviet republics, I mean, over a period of time, with the exception of Ukraine, every other former Soviet republic, independent sovereign countries for the last 30 years have found themselves more and more under Russia's thumb, and you know, pushed away from policies and perspectives that they had been pursuing for the last several years. And in the case of Ukraine, it now seems apparent that Putin's goal is not to try to conquer and hold the entire country, but to divide it up. I mean, there may be more annexation of territory in and around Crimea to consolidate. There's this whole idea of new Russia, which goes back to the Tsarist era. Exactly, extending the whole southern part of Ukraine along the borders of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, going down to Odessa. And that's, of course, where they've been targeting from the sea in amphibious landings and with military moving up from Crimea itself. Seems to be an effort to take Kiev and Kharkiv and, you know, other northern parts of Ukraine with the border with Belarus, and certainly to consolidate the positions in the Donbass region, the two administrative regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. And then, you know, there's kind of a question about what about the rest of Ukraine here. Part of Western Ukraine is seen as, you know, quite distant from Russia and from east towards Russia. It's the predominantly Ukrainian speaking area. It's the part that used to be under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Also, you know, part of it, Transcarpathian Ukraine, has, you know, large minorities of Hungarian speakers. You know, the borders on that side, close to Romania, have, you know, some Romanian minorities and Polish minorities closer to Poland and Slovaks, you know, etc. So it may be that, you know, Putin might leave, you know, some, you know, Western Ukrainian statelet around Lvov or Lviv, you know, where there may be some, not just rump Ukraine, but a kind of government in exile. Maybe that's, you know, part of his plan here. But what you can see here, he wants to shatter and weaken Ukraine. And that seems to be a clear part of his goal. What he's trying to make sure is that all of that former region of, you know, what we might call the kind of Russian Imperium, the places that Russia's writ has extended at different periods of time, he wants to have the ability to veto anything that they do, perhaps even select their leadership, and to kind of put a you know, kind of a kibosh on them joining NATO if they're not already in there, or weakening those bonds with NATO and the European Union, for example.
And I guess, what are planners in Washington and Brussels discussing right now in terms of trying to counter the Russian adventurism?
Well, I mean, part of it is trying to kind of figure out, can we get a durable ceasefire? But Putin doesn't seem to be keen on this idea. I mean, there's just been a discussion and a determination on a humanitarian corridor, because, you know, we're trying to figure out how we can stop him from going that far without actually intervening directly and militarily. So will there be, you know, some impact on the people around him, closest to him, and the military and otherwise, if the, you know, the Ukrainians manage to fight back sufficiently that they blunt the further offensive action? Will basically choking, you know, Russia off from the outside world eventually have some kind of impact in terms of engendering more protest? There's one thing, though, to bear in mind, is that Russia continues to earn revenues from oil and gas sales. It's not just the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Nord Stream 2 means there was a Nord Stream 1, that's still running. The Soviet era pipelines that, Pat, you will remember, you know, only too well, bringing oil and gas from Russia to Europe are still functioning. So when we saw a sudden drop in the ruble, and then it stabilized out at a level because the Russian government, even though lots of commercial ties have been cut off, continues to earn, you know, fairly substantial revenues. The only question is whether they can access the revenues. And, you know, central bank assets have been frozen. If, you know, companies kind of pull out, you're really sort of seeing Russia cut off from, most of the rest of the world. So what we have to see now is how things play out. How things play out on the ground militarily and how things play out over the longer haul. And there's a lot of focus now on the role of China, because we've really had a massive shift in February, just before the beginning of the Olympics, when President Xi of China, along with President Putin, had a pretty dramatic, in the sense of somewhat unexpected, statement about the strategic partnership, although some of the comments had been made before, and they've had these relationships all the way along. I don't think we were expecting China to speak out against NATO or to be quite so strident in the defense of Russia's positions. And so this suddenly makes China part of the European equation, makes Russia part of the Asia-Pacific equation as well. So, a lot of many of us, myself included, think that one of the few ways that one could see if Putin maybe recalculating, it's not because President Macron's called him up, but if President Xi actually said something. But the odds of that seem kind of slim, because it doesn't seem to be in China's interest right now. Even if China may be, slightly uncomfortable, or some of the Chinese leadership might be uncomfortable with what's happening, they're hardly going to shift their position unless it has some blowback from them. So we're going to have to kind of, and that might not be just negative blowback, threats to them, let's put it that way, but also if there's such an upswelling of global opposition that it even starts to affect China's position with key countries. So then, we'll have to see how that plays out. So I think everybody's just trying to figure out right now, how do you get a grip of this? Because as you said, it feels like an eternity already that we've been in war, but it's actually only been a matter of a week. Well, only, if you're in Ukraine, that also seems like an eternity.
I guess it would. And I think, let me just finish, and then one more question, and I think it'll be fairly short. And then I'd like to turn it back to Bob, and other people can have a chance to ask what looks like coming in several interesting.
Yes, I can see there's whole things in the chat. I'll also put on my glasses to take a look at those.
But my final question is, what sources would you suggest to the members to read or to view, so that they can become better informed as this wretched crisis continues?
Well, there's a lot of books and things out there that cover this territory. One of the most insightful books about the history of Ukraine, all of the lands, is Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, which I'm sure people have read. There's a recent book by Mary Elise Sarotti called Not 1 Inch, which goes into the whole depths of the expansion of NATO in the 1990s and what transpired there. There's a couple of books by a colleague of mine, Angela Stent, who's written a book called The Limits of Partnership, which is about the efforts that the United States and Russia have had over a long sweep of time to try to stabilize their relationship, and obviously that hasn't worked. And she's also got a book called Putin's World that describes Putin's worldview and his views of interactions with other countries. There's a lot of books out there that I think would help people to get a grasp of current affairs. In fact, I've got piles of them all over here now. I try to myself, keep on top of things. There really is kind of looking around to see if there's anything else I could sort of suggest here. But those would be, kind of a good start. There's also a very good book. It's quite large, by a gentleman named Vladislav Zubok, which is about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which, kind of also describes how the Soviet Union didn't really collapse, but it was actually picked apart by Boris Yeltsin, who was then the president of the Russian Federation within the Soviet Union, and together with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus when they were republics of the Soviet Union, as part of a power struggle with Mikhail Gorbachev. And of course, that is really the kind of whole starting point for where we are now. This is in some respects one of the wars of the Soviet succession, just like we had all of the wars coming out of the collapse of Yugoslavia. We're still fighting out here, unfortunately, the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union back in 1991.
Well, this has been terrific, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and answer some of my questions. And now let me turn it over to Bob.
Oh, thank you. And I can see when I put my glasses on there, Pat and Bob, that there's quite a lot of questions. So I hope you're going to be able to read them, because the font is so small. It's like,
yes.
Fortunately, I'm nearsighted enough I can read them.
Right.
Thank you, ladies, both, Dr. Hill and Dr. Kushlis, for your conversation. I think everyone would find it quite enlightening. I would remind those who have questions to use the chat feature of Zoom. There is a button in the bottom center of your screen. If you click on it, it opens a dialog box on the right hand side of your screen, and you can pose your question. And with that, Dr. Hill, the first question is from Richard Mason, and he talks about that his preamble is that the Treaty of Versailles contributed to the conditions that brought Hitler to power. Do you think that the West's actions after the fall of the Soviet Union helped with the rise of Putin?
Well, yes, but I think actually there's an awful lot of longer roots there too. And it's interesting that he asked and mentioned the Treaty of Versailles. I think when we're going to be looking back as historians, it might not be us, because it's maybe further on, that there might be some conclusion that we were all engaged or part of right now in another version of 100 Years' War. Because part of the argument for Putin for going into Ukraine, and he's actually said this in his recent speech, goes back to the fall, not just of the Soviet Union, but of the Russian Empire. Mm-hmm. And he blamed Vladimir Lenin and the Communist Party and the whole period of the 1920s, 100 years ago, for some of the decisions that he's trying to reverse today. So he's talking about the creation of Lenin, by Lenin, and it was actually Stalin and others, the Bolsheviks, of the independent Ukrainian Socialist Republic. Efforts to kind of create, Ukrainian language and Ukrainian sense of nationalism, which is actually true. I mean, Lenin and the people around him, the Bolsheviks, they had a nationality policy, and they did do that. They actually did it as a counterweight to Russian nationalism, which they thought that would blow up the whole of their Soviet project. So there's a kernel of historic truth in all of that. But he then uses that as a kind of a justification for Ukraine being dissolved as an independent state. So it's not just what he says about NATO and the way that we've handled or mishandled the relationship with Russia and the expansion of NATO, which I think could have definitely been handled a lot better since the 1990s. Putin himself is taking us back to these earlier periods of history and these justifications. He calls the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, but then he also then talks about the collapse of the Russian Empire as well. So he's dragging us back into earlier periods of time. And what the question is in putting this into the Treaty of Versailles, of course, is that we had the interwar period with the Weimar Republic and this feelings of loss and of grievance, being hit hard economically, which Russia was in the 1990s. But Germany, as a whole, not really getting over that sort of sense of loss of its own empire and the Kaiser and the whole structure in World War I, and never quite recovering from that. And then the myth making that Hitler and others, had around that about what the reasons were. And we can see Putin doing the same thing. And we've, certainly contributed to it. I mean, in many respects, of course, Maynard Keynes and others complained about the West and the reparations clause in the various treaties, and the way that we tried to squeeze that memorable moment, kind of Germany as if it was like a lemon until, the pips dried. I mean, I remember that from, all of my coursework on, World War I and the interwar period. And although, we didn't impose reparations on on Russia, that Russia did have to take on, the Soviet era debts. And Putin's just put all of that together. So, and in the same way that the Second World War was a continuation of World War I, I've been arguing that what we're seeing now with Putin is a continuation of all of these points from the Russian or Putin's perspective, because it's that sense of loss that he's talking about, the loss of Russia's position, the loss of empire, the loss of territory, and then how he believes that the West, the United States, NATO, and everything else took advantage of Russia in that time frame. But again, we've got 100 years of history all packaged into what we're seeing today as well.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
With the invasion of Ukraine and the economic sanctions that have been put on to Russia as a result of that, how long, if you had a crystal ball, how long would you think that Putin is going to be able to maintain his position in power? Will the oligarchs, will the people who are being severely impacted by the economic sanctions take any action? And if they do, who would be his successor?
Well, who will be his successor? I have no idea. Because at this point, Putin himself, I think, has been, quite paranoid about looking like a lame duck. Well, it's just this before invasion of Ukraine, let's just say, and was himself tamping down any ideas of a successor, even though one assumed that he's been having something in mind, because he didn't want people to think that he wasn't going to be around. I mean, in a highly centralized hierarchical system like Russia, if Putin said he was definitely leaving in 2024, which is, when his current term expires, and then there'd be a free-for-all, no doubt, around him of people wanting to be chosen as a successor and everybody watching this extremely closely. And he was chosen as successor of Boris Yeltsin after many other people were cycled through. So, Putin doesn't want to sort of spark off that palace infighting and intrigue, which happened the first time around. And we've got to remember, he stepped aside from being president once before in 2007 and put in place Dmitry Medvedev, who he's not likely to put in place again in 2008 for a 4-year term. And the fact that he extended the constitution, or amended the constitution to extend his presidential terms up till 2036, also underscores that he is very nervous about that whole kind of process of succession. One reason why he might have launched this massive invasion of Ukraine to make sure of retaking Ukraine is to basically prepare himself ahead of the election in 2024. It could even have been of kind of forging his next presidency in the atmosphere of a war, to basically get people to rally round more and to actually head off in some respects, because he probably thought this was going to be a victorious war, the very eventuality that you're outlining, or that the question is outlining there. Because Putin knows how vulnerable he is. The longer you are in power, the more likely you are to either die in office, be removed by the people around you, or be removed as a result of mass protest, the less likely you are to be able to choose the method of your departure. So that is the situation that he's in, right now. It's very precarious. He's become the wild card in the system. And so this isn't really so much as a crystal ball, but trying to interpret the tarot cards, I guess, right?
Yes.
Rather than anything else. What
Read
do
the
I
tea
have?
leaves.
Do I have the tea leaves and, the entrails, something as, kind of probably some of my ancestors did at different points, throwing out the little bones and, chicken bits to kind of see how they fall down. But I think that, when we all look at that, he's really put himself in a very difficult position. I mean, he can really clamp down. He could, kind of keep control until he doesn't, because what if there is something wrong with him, with his health? Yeah. Any kind of sign of weakness and loss, any sign that he is fallible, rather than the Superman, strong man, all powerful, all seeing, all adaptable person who, if he makes a mistake, he quickly learns from this. If that proves not to be the case, because, every other previous time we said, oh, that'll be a quagmire, that won't work out. It's actually worked out very well for him. And he's basically said to Macron today, no, I haven't made a mistake. I'm going to see this to its end. Well, I guess, he will see it to its end, but neither he nor us really know what that end is going to be right now. And that's the real danger. I mean, he was only in control the moment before he made this decision and set it in motion. And I can't see how this is going to end either. But the more that we push back, the more that Ukrainians resist, there are all kinds of different factors that are going to come into play here that he won't be able to control.
Okay. I have a couple of questions dealing with the nuclear issue.
Yeah.
One is apparently, as we know, the Russians immediately took control of the Chernobyl site, which doesn't have any particular value other than there's a lot of dirty, nasty stuff there. Apparently, one of the major nuclear reactors that's still online has been attacked, and whether it's out of commission or not, we don't know yet. And of course, Putin has put his forces on nuclear alert. Do you think if he decides he wants to use the nuclear option in any way, will the military let him?
Well, in some respects, he's already used it, right? By even mentioning it. Yeah. He's put it on the table for us all to inspect. Because, let's think about the circumstances in which he suddenly went onto the, high military alert and sent, the guys off to the nuclear installations. This is only a few days into the conflict where they got bogged down. But, what we were seeing in Ukraine was not, kind of a full launch assault on his convoys, but a whole load of people making Molotov cocktails. So it just seems disproportionate, right, in terms of a response. We know, of course, that this is part of what we call the Russian strategy of escalate to de-escalate, which is scare the hell out of everybody, and lots of demonstrations of force or high rhetoric, and expect us to pull back ourselves, to be intimidated and coerced, and to then submit in some way. Now, the United States hasn't risen to the bait, and I'm sure that an awful lot of your colleagues out there in New Mexico, at Scandia and Los Alamos and elsewhere, carefully monitoring, the situation. We've not gone onto alert. We've actually, I think, sent messages saying, hey, come on, what are you doing here? But Putin clearly wants us to be in that state of worrying about first, nuclear use of a battlefield or tactical nuclear weapon. They've also raised the spectre that Ukraine might have been trying to get a nuclear weapon, which is, of course, bogus. But it's, to kind of, that was one of the reasons, of course, why we went after Iran and also North Korea. So, I mean, they're trying to kind of put Ukraine in the rogue pariah state, though, for the population at home in Russia, by the way, because if you can't justify it through this denazification, liberation of Ukraine, maybe he's going to start shifting to say, well, we had to do this because Ukrainians were trying to get a nuclear weapon. And then they were maybe trying to use these nuclear sites. But if he has control of the nuclear sites of Chernobyl, or seizes control of other nuclear installations for, the civilian energy generation, he may be able to use this to sort of spin that he's, taking control of these sites because of nefarious Ukrainian work with centrifuges. Who knows what he's going to say here? I'm just, spitballing because he's moving things into the level of absurd propaganda. But he clearly wants us to think about and to consider about what he might do, because he's the kind of guy who, if he has an instrument, he will use it. He already created a dirty bomb of sorts when he poisoned Alexander Litvinenko with polonium in London. They've already used nerve agents, weapons-grade nerve agents, Novichok, at least twice that we know of, in Salisbury against Sergei Skripal, and the second time in the most bizarre fashion in Alexei Navalny's underpants to try to assassinate him. We know that they've already invaded countries or intervened when we didn't think they would. They've used paramilitary forces to shoot at our special forces in Syria. So Putin, of course, wants us to know that he's done all of these things, and they've exercised with, battlefield nuclear weapons. They have Iskanders, nuclear-capable missiles in Kaliningrad, the exclave that's, kind of surrounded by Poland, Belarus, and Lithuanian, territory. So when Putin puts it out there and makes this alert and makes a big noise about it, he wants us to know that he's trying to figure out if there's some way to do this for demonstration effect. And he's already rhetorically demonstrated that. So we have to take it serious. We have to figure out how we're going to deal with it and how we're going to head it off. We can't completely discount it because, as Putin showed with the invasion, if people say he's not going to do something, he pretty much often does it. We haven't to be scared and intimidated. We have to watch this very closely. We have to behave as we have been behaving with, cool-headed fashion. But we have to realize he's already played the nuclear card by putting it out there on the table. And he intends, to, basically try to scare us with that.
I noticed in today's news, there was some discussion of the number of people who are trying to leave Russia, who are, see, this is going to be the repression that is in the offing for any protest, but also just the possibility of the severe economic sanctions. What do you think he will close his borders?
He might well. I think that's a really good point. I've already talked on Zooms earlier in the day with people who were normally in Moscow and are now somewhere else and didn't want to say where they were. Russian analysts and others from various think tanks. Journalists and others have left and fled because of this too. And, there's a lot of businesses. Look, there's a lot of Western businesses that have been operating in Moscow. The company my husband works for has a Moscow office and they're basically closing it. And it's not all Russian staff either, Western staff and others. And, kind of with airline routes being closed down, Russian airlines being denied airspace, or rather, overflight of European airspace. Russia's closing its airspace for transcontinental flights as well. We're right there now in that same period as when Pat was, working in the region in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was closed down. And just to be clear here, there's a lot of people around Putin who are not the oligarchs that we talk about, but the hard guys in the Russian military and in the Russian security services who are quite happy with this. Because, for them, they do want to be back in the USSR in many respects. They want to be feared and respected for the fear that that they engender. They're not living in that interconnected world, and they're the people who are supporting Putin to the hilt on this. It just, may be that the pressure will build on them as well.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing given that you've got a young population there that doesn't remember those days, and their base of knowledge is completely different from the old guys. Yeah,
this is going to be a massive shock for them. I mean, all the people who were interconnected and were sort of like thinking about life like kind of ordinary kids. Look, it's the same for ours. I was in Michigan earlier on the week, and I went basically to speak to the World Affairs Council out in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and they've got 11 colleges, community colleges and universities all part of it. So there's hundreds of students. And many of the students, basically said, can you explain to us about what happened in Crimea in 2014? I'm too young, I don't remember what happened. And of course, I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, that just seemed like yesterday to me, just like Pat said, it was just, and then you realize that there's an awful lot of people who have no memory of any of this. Of course, that's the case. And in Russia, Putin's already been there for 22 years. There's a lot of younger Russians. He's the only president they've known. They don't remember any of the deprivations of the 1990s, as they did. They're really young. It's only really people who are in their 50s who really have any, and above obviously, who have any really concrete memories of that kind of period of the late Soviet period in the 80s. And, who were kind of, come of age. I mean, that's like me. I mean, I was a student in the Soviet Union, 1987, 1988. So, I mean, I remember it pretty vividly. But, others who were younger are not really going to be able to fully comprehend about what it is that they might be going back to. Or going to, because you never really go back. You always kind of go forward into something else, but something that's going to be shaped in a very similar fashion. And they're not going to like that.
Right. Our hour has passed far too quickly. Ladies, again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy lives to share your thoughts with us. We do appreciate it. And one question I would have for you, Dr. Hill, would you mind sending me an email with a list of some books that you would suggest that we read, besides yours, of course, and so that I can pass them on to our membership?
Absolutely. I'd be delighted to. I mean, I hope people, remembered the names of the books that I'd mentioned. And, I'll work with my colleague Lucy to get you our, top hits of reading this. I tell you, I've got like, actually, it's just, well, you can't see how messy my office is beyond this little square, but I've got piles of books all over the place, some of which I can highly recommend. So, yeah.
Okay. We would appreciate it very much. And again, thank y'all. Thank you very much. Thank everybody for tuning in. I hope you got as much out of this as I did. And I would remind you that our next virtual meeting will be next Tuesday, March the 8th, and our subject will be climate change and global security. Again, thank you, ladies. Have a wonderful evening, and we do appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.